Viktor Orban has made a surprise visit into the capital city of Ukraine, into Kyiv, and has met with Volodymyr Zelensky, coming on the heels of a lot of contentions that's been happening between those two over quite a number of months. Was very surprising, and especially given the statements that we've been reading that are coming out of that. We're trying to get some of the sound out already. Hopefully, at some point, we'll be able to bring you some of the actual interviews that they've been saying in the press conference that they had. We're still trying to find one that's translated. But what we do know already is, according to the Washington Post, that Viktor Orban has come with a message that he wants Zelensky to make an immediate ceasefire. That goes in the face of many things that we've been talking about, of what the war has been going on, with what Zelensky has been saying, a lot of which we're going to talk about here shortly. But to try and make sense of what all we're seeing here, we have the ever popular Colonel Jacques Baud, former Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service and also former NATO officer. Colonel, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back to your show. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure for us to have, because your insights and your understanding of things is just almost unmatched, and we're always grateful for it. And this is a great one here because we've been, there's been lots of issues and a lot of bad blood between Zelensky and Orban. Most recently I think on the June 27th, just a week or so ago, there was some a little bit of an exchange there, which Gary's showing right there, on one of the European meetings, and there's a little surprise that he showed up today. First of all, I want to know if you have any understanding of what led to this and what you've heard that's been discussed so far.
Well, I think, first of all, what we have to understand is that Viktor Orban has a very special relationship with Ukraine as compared to other leaders in Europe. And the reason is that Hungary is one of the few European countries that have a minority in Ukraine. And this is sometimes forgotten in our media. Of course, you know that Ukraine is made up by many minorities. The most important one you have the two most important ones are the Ukrainian one, the one that is in the center and the north of Ukraine, and the Russian one, which is the second largest minority in the east and the southern part of the country. And but there are other minorities. There are Romanian minority, there are a Slovak minority and Polish minority, and you have, of course, an Hungarian minority in the western part of Ukraine, in Transcarpathia, in fact. And the problem is that as I have said a couple of times in your show, that we tend to forget that as the new government or the new authorities came out of the coup d'etat in Maidan in 2014, this ultra-nationalist government started to persecute minorities. And of course, we have talked much about the Russian minority because it's the most important one, and that's the one that triggered the reaction within Donbass and prompted political action from Russia. But there are other minorities that were affected by the new rules of the new government in 2014, and namely the Hungarian one. And since 2014, the Hungarian government in Hungary, which is very much linked to these Hungarian minorities in Ukraine, have complained several times to the Council of Europe. And because of the mistreatment of the minority, including the use of Hungarian language, which has been strongly limited by the new laws in Ukraine. I remind you that since 2014, the Ukrainian government has established new rules about the official languages, that the Ukrainian language has become the only official language. And the other languages are not forbidden, but they are no longer official, meaning that they may not be used in school, for instance, or in local administrations, for instance, think like that. The language themselves are not forbidden. It's important to mention that because some say that, but it's wrong. They were not forbidden, but they were no longer official. And meaning that a lot of people who are of Hungarian tradition or for the Russian tradition, they never really learned Ukrainian language. And therefore, all interaction between themselves and the government happened in the other official language. And the same happened to the Hungarian minority. And since 2014, this has disappeared, and that's led to several problems and demonstration, protests, repression, strong repression, and very violent repression against the Hungarian minority. And that has led to tensions between Hungary and Ukraine. And that's the reason, by the way, why, for instance, Viktor Orban refused to let Western weapons transiting through Hungary towards Ukraine. All the weapons that are provided by the US, by Germany, and so on and so forth, all these weapons transit through Poland and Slovakia, sometimes through Romania. I mean, for instance, the French have several bases in Romania, but they don't transit through you.
And what is so? I understand that Orban has some concerns because of the sizable Ukrainian population. I think he said in an interview I watched a week or so ago, he said it was around 200,000. He noted that many of them were being drafted into the war, that many of them were dying in the conflict. So he has a lot of concerns. But what is the benefit, or what is the intent, maybe a better word, for Orban not to allow NATO weapons to transit his country?
Because he feels that he is feeding the repression against its own minority, if you want. It's in the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. So he complained about the brutality of the Ukrainian regime against the Hungarian minority, and he doesn't want to support this type of behavior by providing weapons. That's the rationale. And he is, of course, there is another aspect of Viktor Orban, and probably that's why he is highly respected, I think, in Europe, not by the establishment, but by the population, is because he looks for the national interest of the Hungarian people. That's for the Hungarian people, I mean, including the minority in Ukraine, but also its own population, meaning that he doesn't want to have his country being involved in a conflict against Russia, for instance. He wants to have a kind of a neutral stance in this conflict. He doesn't want to be dragged into a conflict that he didn't choose. On the contrary, he would like to solve the problem of the minorities, but not to go into a conflict, and not to go in a conflict with Russia that in basically struggles for the same problem as he has with the Ukrainian government towards the Hungarian minority.
And it's interesting that you bring up that issue about how he views a lot of the at least the Western elite, and how he looks at the people in Hungary, because that kind of goes to some of the bad blood between him and Zelensky, going all the way back to the first year of the war. Here's a view during that first year where Orban went to Texas, of all places, to give a speech, and listen to what he says about the globalists.
We have seen what kind of future the globalist ruling class has to offer. But we have a different future in mind. The globalists can all go to hell. I have come to Texas.
And so he laid that out pretty clear, but also in 2022, that attitude of saying the globalists, and in the other context of his comments there, he was saying there's a big split within the West. Some wanted to go to war with Russia, some him not wanting to do that. And so he was reticent to do that. Now, Zelensky didn't take too kindly to that. Here's what he said early in the war in March.
Взуття в Маріуполі. Там такі ж самі люди, дорослі, і діти, і дідусі, і бабусі, і їх там тисячі. І цих тисяч вже немає. А ти вагаєшся вводити санкції або ні? Вагаєшся пропускати зброю або ні? Вагаєшся торгувати з Росією або ні? Немає часу вагатися. Час вже вирішувати.
It didn't seem to have much of an impact because in the next year, Orban said, look, here's my bottom line is there is no path. We've been saying it almost every time you're on here. There is no military path to victory. Obviously, Orban thinks the same thing as he said here.
Really think there is no chance of Ukraine winning.
That's
and
my
point. They stand very little chance of winning without the aid which you are currently blocking.
No, my position is that looking at the reality, looking at the figures, looking at the surroundings, looking at the fact that NATO is not ready to send troops, it's obvious that there is no victory for poor Ukrainians on the battlefield. That's my position.
And that's animated his actions, and he stood up to all of the pressure from the West.
Well, in fact, his observation is perfectly right. I mean, I wrote my first book on the Ukraine conflict. It's Operation Z that I wrote, and it was published in October 2022. And I said exactly the same thing. Though that was about more than 6 months before he said that. So this was obvious that the conflict. Remember that the idea of the West was to make Russia to collapse, not through war on a battlefield, but through economic war by imposing massive and brutal sanctions on Russia. And that's exactly what the French Minister of Economy said on the 1st of March 2022. He said, we will make Russia to collapse. And that was the idea. But the problem is that we noticed, and I think the Americans, by the way, noticed that very quickly, that in reality, this didn't work, and that the Russian economy was more resilient than expected. As a result, there was no hope to have a military success for Ukraine. And in fact, if you remember, the US started to press Zelensky as soon as in November 22 to engage in negotiations with Russia. And that's very strange, because in the first part of the year and the first part of the Russian intervention, the West made everything possible to prevent any kind of agreement. But by the end of 2022, it was clear that there was no way that Ukraine would achieve any kind of success. And that's the reason why for US the solution was negotiation. And one of the reasons for this kind of let's say behavior from the US is that the US didn't want to enter the presidential election race with a conflict that would not be ended. So an unending conflict. And I think the US has very soon understood that it was not the case. But since the Europeans wanted to continue with this conflict, I think the US said, okay, let's do it. Let's give it a try. That's more or less what they did, and provided weapons for that, because then the problem was the idea was no longer to have Russia to collapse, but to have Russia let's say, weakened by a prolonged war. And that was a kind of war of attrition, which is not an economic attrition per se. It's more a political attrition. They expect that at the end of the day, the Russian population would say, enough with this conflict, and turn over to revert to Vladimir Putin and ask to stop the conflict. That's the expectation of the West.
Let me ask your opinion on that point there. Which population, Ukraine or Russia, do you think could tire of the casualty count first, whichever one it is. And it almost doesn't even matter the actual number. It only matters what the population thinks about that number. Do you see either of them in any kind of near-term possibility where the population could turn against the casualties and want the war to end?
Well, I think definitely the Ukrainian will get more tired before, because first of all, the figures we have about the casualties, more basically with what we see as the figures for the Russian casualties come from the Ukrainian propaganda. And I assume they just make kind of a projection. The figures we have, in fact, are the Ukrainian casualties, and they tend to be mirrored to explain that these are the Russian casualties, but it seems not. And the reason I'm saying that is that you have a website, and you can check by yourself, don't take my word for it. You can check this media. It's a Media Zona. Media Zona is a website that is run by the opposition, the Russian opposition. By the way, it's based in Latvia or in Estonia. I don't remember, in one of the two countries. Anyway, this Media Zona, together with the BBC, makes a count of the casualties suffered by Russia by monitoring the social networks and available media in Russia. And based on that, they monitor all the obituaries and things like this in order to have, let's say, a picture of the number of casualties of the Russians. And they come to figures that are about 10 times lower than the one we see in the New York Times or Washington Post also. And therefore, we can assume that the ratio between the casualties in Ukraine and in Russia is probably 1 to 10. I mean, you have 1 Russian dead for 10 Ukrainian dead, more or less, based on these figures. I mean, the methodology of Media Zona, we can probably discuss that, but I think this is the most, let's say, the most serious methodology we have to count.
And, to your point there, I saw, I think it was just 2 days ago, the New York Times was reporting that British intelligence has been saying that the Russians are sustaining an unimaginable ratio over the last month or so of 1,200 dead per day, and they're just astounded that they can keep fighting. And yet I haven't seen any physical evidence of it. And what you're talking about, Media Zona, seems to be completely contradicting that. And then what has to answer or ask the question, what's the value of that? What's the purpose?
Well, I think the idea is to stimulate or to encourage this kind of fatigue in the Russian population, to say, your government is lying to you. You have a lot of casualties, a lot of fatalities, and you don't know it because you don't have proper information and all that. That I think we are in a propaganda war. We are in a propaganda war. There is no.
It seems to me, though, Colonel, it's you have to be smart about how you have a propaganda war. If you're doing stuff that's self-evidently not true, it makes you look stupid. And so when we say, and I've seen this, I'm not talking literally the entire war. Russia's suffering 1,000 casualties per day. Now it's 1,200. They just keep saying that over and over, and yet you see the line continuing to move to the west. And so at some point, you got to say, you guys are just stupid, and no one's going to believe you.
Well, the thing is that, in fact, there is no official figures provided by Ukraine about, for instance, their own casualties. There's no official. I mean, the Russians neither, by the way. None of both of them produce official figures about their own casualties. The only figures we have about Ukrainian casualties are provided by the Russians, and the only figures we have about the Russian casualties provided by the Ukrainian government. So basically, we can say that there is no official source of information about these numbers. So Media Zona is, I'm not sure it's the most reliable source, but given the fact that there is no official figures, looking at the methodology that is described on the website, by the way, I think this makes more sense.
Plausible. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, and by the way, that was the same thing when we were at the beginning of the military operation. We heard about all these Russian tanks being destroyed and everything, all these aircraft being destroyed, and you had this website also counting all these the number of tanks, and most of this figure, I mean, even photographs that were provided about destroyed Russian tanks and all that. Most of these pictures have been, in fact, debunked. They were out of context or out of this conflict. Even you had pictures of Ukrainian tanks, but they were labeled as Russian tanks. So it was all kind of manipulation in that. So we are in a propaganda war. Again, the name of the game is to have a regime change in Russia, remember. So the idea is to inform or misinform the Russian population so that the Russian population would say stop to the war. And that's, in fact, from a pure psychological warfare point of view, makes a lot of sense. The problem is that when we try to make an assessment of the conflict, we have to go beyond that. We have to understand these things. I mean, journalists are journalists, and too bad for them, but that's the way they are. They believe that, and they use that. But when you go into more serious analysis, and when you start to assess the conflict, in order to make a real strategic assessment of the situation, then we have to go beyond the figure game and all that. And
it's ironic, Colonel, is that we were talking about this a little bit before we came on the air about the differences in the level of analysis and statecraft, like 30 and 40 years ago, during the Cold War, when you and I were both actually serving nearly the same time, as opposed to now. And I'm going to take that example you just gave as a point here, that the propaganda war, or whatever the intent or the desire is for some in the West, was to actually get rid of Putin, to have a regime change. And number one, that is just so bizarre to me, because even the mentality, the thought that there would be someone else that would rise to power in Russia that would somehow be amenable to the West is just ludicrous if they spend any time at all looking at Russian politics and seeing the other players on the board. It could get a lot worse, but there's no prospect that it would suddenly get better. So why would you even want to seek a regime change?
Well, that's why we are facing a very strange kind of behavior from the Western leadership at large. It's totally irrational, and it's even more irrational that all this is based on the assumption that Vladimir Putin is a dictator, and that people hate dictators, and therefore the Russian population should hate Putin. And even though that, if in the various my books, I explained that looking at the figures, the polls that have been made in Russia, and namely I take the figures provided by the Levada Center, which is a poll organization, a company that provides polls in Russia, which is considered by Russia as a foreign agent, because in fact Levada used to be, I don't know if it's still the case, but a couple of years ago, it was still funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is funded by the US government. And that's a reason why it's considered as a foreign agent. Now, if you look at the figures provided by the center, you will see that the popularity of Vladimir Putin, especially, before the Russian special military operation, the popularity was roughly around 60%. probably a little bit more, 65%. And just after the start of the special military operation, the popularity of Vladimir Putin raised to 80%. And since then, it has never been under, with the exception of in October 2022, as you had the event in Kharkov and in Kherson. And that made the popularity ratio to go to something to 77% or something like that.
Yeah.
But now, since a couple of months, it's above 85%. So the population is strongly in support to Vladimir Putin. And something we should take into account is that all the terrorist attacks that were sponsored or helped or provoked or done, or we can use the verb you want, by Ukraine and the West in Russia. I mean, the attack against Vladimir Dugin, the daughter of Dugin, Tatarsky in Dagestan, also recently in Crocus.
Right.
Exactly. All these attempts to make terrorist attacks has in fact increased the support of the Russian population to Vladimir Putin. And the support to the war has increased because, the Russians, don't forget that is a population that suffered 22 million casualties during World War II, meaning that this is a population which is used to resist, and they are extremely determined when it comes to national security, and they are not getting influenced or weakened by any attempt to influence them through terrorism or that. That will have exactly the opposite effect, and that's exactly what we're witnessing.
Yeah, which I guess underscores the issue. And actually, one of our viewers told me here just I guess during this broadcast here on a text message that Russia is whatever the actual number of casualties are, whether Mediazone is right or whether it's maybe more than that, who knows. But he said the Russian population will be able to sustain this for another 20 years if it came down to it, because of, I think, the very thing that you just said there, and that is crucial, vitally important for the West to understand when they're starting to form policies. And that gets me back again to Viktor Orban, because he seems to be aware of some of these things, and he keeps talking over and over. In fact, Gary, if you can play the one of him where he's trying to opt out of NATO support. I want to show you what he said there. I want to talk about something on the backside.
Azt látom, hogy Magyarországnak mindenképpen ki kell maradni abból az akcióból, amit a NATO úgy hív, hogy a NATO ukrajnai missziója. Ha abban mi csak a kis hújunkat is beletesszük, akár csak a tervezési fázisban is részt veszünk, be fog bennünket szippantani.
So there's no path to victory, as we had him saying a second ago. You see him saying there that this just can't be won. So he recognizes a lot of those things. And now then here he comes into Ukraine, and the first thing that he says publicly is that he's seeking or recommending a ceasefire, a negotiated settlement. And again, our viewer here, David, suggests and actually wanted me to ask you what you thought about the possibility that Orban, who we know has a relationship with Russia, that he's maybe trying to help negotiate an end to it, something along the lines of what Putin himself said, I guess it was earlier in June, about here's my terms for a negotiated settlement.
Well, the thing is that, as you have noticed, since the beginning of the special military operation, the world has been polarized around this. But so that's what we know. But what we tend to ignore is that we have cut almost every line of communications with Russia. And meaning that today, even if we wanted to resume some kind of diplomatic relationship or some type of negotiation, who would do that? I mean, I told you that in November, as early November 2022, the U.S. started to press Zelensky to start negotiation. The U.S. didn't want to start that themselves because that would be just a losing face, in fact. So they prefer to press the Ukrainians to start something. And the Ukrainians now are exactly in the same game. They don't want to lose face also towards the Ukrainian opinion, and therefore there is no real communication lines. We had very recently, you have Lord Austin calling Belousov the Minister of Defense, but this is the rare. I mean, that was the first time since
Over a
about
year,
15
yeah.
years, exactly.
Right.
So, meaning that we don't have any channel of communication. And the problem is, in such a situation, do we try to get a kind of intermediary or mediation, or a mediator somehow? And there are only few candidates for that. I mean, China could be one, but this is a mediator that probably the US would not accept. Turkey could be one because they tried to use this kind of behavior between the two blocks, and Hungary. And the Swiss could do that. I mean, historically, the Swiss could have done that. The problem is that the Swiss have been so reckless regarding the use of sanctions. I remind you that even today, Switzerland has more sanction on Russia than the EU, and even more than Australia or Japan or things like that. I think today the first three sanctioning countries on Russia is the US, Canada, and Switzerland. So that means that Switzerland, that used to be neutral, and a neutral country, and that's exactly what, by the way, Alan Dulles, who used to be the director of the CIA in the 60s, remember that Alan Dulles was also the head of the OSS during World War II. And he understood.
The center of gravity is the civilian population. And if you
Sorry about that. Please continue.
Oh, sorry. And Alan Dulles understood the value of having a neutral country as a kind of exit ramp for conflicts, because that provides a very interesting way out of a conflict by involving a neutral country. But Switzerland has not lost this position. Now, Orban can do that. Orban is part of NATO, is part of the EU. He has maintained good relationships with Russia. I remind you that Hungary still receives the Russian gas through Turk Stream, so from the south. Since the one of the two pipelines, the pipelines that used to drive the gas through Ukraine, one of the two has been shut down by Ukraine. The other one is still active, but it goes to Slovakia and Austria and Poland, I think. But the southern pipeline, Brasvo or Brotherhood, has been shut down. So Hungary still.
Let me ask you this: so what taking him, and let's say that he wants to try to play that role, and evidence implies that he does. What do you think is going to be the level of success when he's going to go? So Gary showed you those clips a second ago from December 2023, from June 27th, this past a week or so ago, when there's obviously some friction between the two here. Given that 3 days ago, here's what Zelensky said about his current focus of the war.
The world has enough power to force Russia into peace. And in particular, defending the Kharkiv region from the Russian offensive, we have proven that the determination of our partners truly helps. Strikes on the Russian border areas helped protect lives. So will further decisions, the bold decisions that must be made, that we need and that we are discussing with our partners. In the coming weeks, we will continue our communication to achieve the necessary decisions.
Okay, so just on the surface of it, he's basically saying, no, I'm just going to ignore everything that's going to happen. I'm ignoring all of my casualties, the imbalance of the number of casualties that the Russians have suffered, the millions more Russians that they have to pull from for future. I'm going to ignore all that, and I'm going to keep going. So when Orban lands today, and he's talking about wanting to have a negotiated settlement and a ceasefire. How much success do you think he's going to have with Zelensky?
Well, there's something that you didn't mention, but just after the conference in Switzerland, the conference in the summit in Bergerstock, we noticed obviously that it was a failure not to invite Russia to such a meeting, and that's the reason why this summit has only handled only 3 points of the 10 points formula of Zelensky. And after the meeting, the Swiss authorities, but also Zelensky himself, said that in fact, to have any chance of success, we should have another conference, but then to invite Russia to the conference. And that is, I think, the important point. Meaning that, on the one hand, you see Zelensky, he doesn't want to abandon the fight on the battlefield. And he wants to continue fighting, and he wants to show the Western countries and also to his own population that he's not giving up fighting the Russians. But on the other hand, he realizes that his own resources are going smaller and smaller, that even the resources that the West can provide in terms of weaponry and probably also finance to some extent are getting smaller and smaller. And we have seen the psychodrama with the Patriot missiles, and now you have the US asking Israel to provide Patriot missiles to Ukraine, which is kind of strange since Israel is expecting a war with Lebanon and Hezbollah. And so we see that, and I think the Ukrainians understand that today the prospect for them to receive as many weapons as they received in the last 2 years, this prospect are fading away. So meaning that they have to find a solution. And they also see that despite all the determination and also the bravery, because to some extent we can talk about the bravery of the Ukrainians, he will not stop the Russians. And if the Russians are constrained to continue fighting against Ukraine, the only solution, and I think I've said that many times now, that the fact that the Europeans want Ukraine to continue fighting, the only option for Russia is to completely destroy Ukraine. And that's what we are witnessing now. And therefore, Zelensky understands that if he wants to save or to keep a part of Ukraine, he has to find a political solution. He will not.
Let me add one more level of pressure on Zelensky. This headline also, this was on NBC News earlier today, talking about that there was another coup attempt thwarted in Ukraine right on the eve of Orban's arrival here. And that's at least the second one in 3 weeks that I've seen publicly. I don't know what may have been going on behind the scenes, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the potential risk that he has, Zelensky, if he continues going down this path of even internal potential like coups or people that are unhappy with these casualties and him wanting to continue on. Well, how much does that play into his decisions?
Well, in fact, Zelensky has an extremely uncomfortable situation. He's sitting between two chairs. He is sitting between the chair that tells him to negotiate with Russia. And that's something, by the way, remember that he was elected with the program of making peace with Russia. But 1 month after his election, in the media, the Ukrainian media, Dmitry Yarosh, who was the leader of the Pravi sector, and he's now the leader of the Ukrainian Volunteer Army. This is a Ukrainian army which doesn't belong to the Ministry of Defense. It's not subordinated to the Ministry of Defense. It's a extreme right-wing army based on volunteers. They are very well armed and they fight along with the Ukrainian army. But it's a very strong force. I mean, at the beginning of the military operation, it was something between 20 and 40,000 combatants. So it's not negligible. And so these guys said in the media that if Zelensky would negotiate with Russia, he would be killed, and he would be hanged on the highest tree on the one of the avenues of Kyiv. So that was officially and openly said. So Zelensky knows that if he tries to negotiate with Russia, he might be killed. Remember also that in the very first round of negotiation that happened as soon as in end of February 2022, just one day after the beginning of the special military operation, Zelensky called the Swiss foreign minister and asked to organize a peace conference. And you had a first round of conference of negotiations starting at the border of Belarus. Remember that the Ukrainian negotiators were killed by the Ukrainians themselves. And this was confessed by Kirilo Budanov, who is the head of the military intelligence, Ukrainian military intelligence, because one of the negotiators was an agent of the military intelligence. And he was killed by the other intelligence service, the not intelligence, but security service, the SBU. And he was killed. And you had, during that period, I mean, end of February, early March 2022, that a couple of these guys who were wanted to negotiate with the Russians, they were bluntly killed in the streets. I mean, you had attacks with police cars stopping the car of the guy. The guy was just shot, gunned down by a machine gun and things like that. And so mafia-like attacks. So that happened. So meaning that there is a small, a part of the Ukrainian ultranationalist population that will refuse any kind of negotiation with Russia. And the other hand,
I wonder if you think, I wonder if you can, you can tell me if I'm drawing connections that might not belong here, but on that screen that Gary showed a second ago, on the 27th of June, you had that interaction between Orban and Zelensky. Later on that same day, Zelensky released this video.
We don't have too much time because we have a lot of wounded and dead people on the battlefield and through civilians. That's why we don't want to have this war during years.
And then the other one I showed you 3 days later, now he's back to the belligerent still. So he's not talking about we're running out of time, we need to make a negotiated settlement, or even implying that. And one has to wonder, there's lots of pressures on him. And then the question is going to be, what's going to happen now that Orban physically came there? What is your expectation?
Well, I think Orban will play this kind of the role of a kind of exit ramp for the West. And probably the US is, he probably did that in accordance with the US, probably not the Europeans, but the US, because the US has understood that the thing is lost and we have to find a settlement for this conflict, because otherwise the West will lose more and Ukraine will lose more than they will gain anything with this conflict. So that's my personal view. And probably Zelensky knows that. He knows that Orban is not on his own here. He has the support of the US in doing that. That's my personal view. I have no proof to demonstrate that.
Okay.
But
that's a fascinating idea, because as we've been talking on this show with a number of other people here recently, for Biden to recognize the situation here and to do anything besides try and stretch this out to November 5th would be to admit that they were wrong, that his plan wasn't working, that everything he had done the previous 2 years was a disaster, and that would be a big losing play in an election coming up. But if they had an ally who could go in there and that they could negotiate something, and then we would say, well, if that's what the parties want, we would support it. Now all of a sudden you don't have to admit defeat. So who knows if something like that's going on? If we, I think we may have, I either I
That's
froze him
exactly
up, and
the thing.
okay, there we go.
Do you see me? Okay.
I do now. Yeah.
I think there is. Yes, I think it's a good idea to have a proxy to have this kind of negotiation, because Zelensky, and that's the other share on which he's sitting at the same time, is because there is a reality, and he sees that there is the population, the Ukrainian population, is no longer ready to go along with him. They don't want to fight anymore. You had recently a few battalions who refused orders on the battlefield. So that's what you call a mutiny in technical terms. So meaning that we see, and recently there was also an issue with even one of the hardest unit, the Azov, this assault brigade, that was the former Azov brigade that now is the third assault brigade, and they also refused orders.
Yeah.
So meaning that you see within the Ukrainian armed forces, you have a reluctance to go into fights that are desperate fights. They are ready to fight, but not into desperate fights as we had in Bakhmut, where the Ukrainians sent troops that we knew they would die. We knew from the very beginning. And that was even reflected in some English paper, by the way, that the soldier complained, an officer, an Ukrainian officer, said that he didn't understand why he should fight for a position that everybody knows that they would leave that position within a few days. So they had to defend that and lose soldiers to defend this position, and although they knew that this position will be abandoned within a few days. So this, for a lot of Ukrainians, this doesn't make any sense, and for this reason, Zelensky understands that his resources are limited in time. And
so what do you think is the prospect that this visit by Orban accomplishes something?
I think I don't have the crystal ball, but I think that if Orban can start a process, and if Zelensky understands that this is the opportunity that he was looking for when he was talking about organizing a next conference, that could lead to this the conduct of this new conference involving Russia. I mean, the Bergenstock II, this second summit, not to discuss the 10-point formula of Zelensky, but to have a fresh, a new discussion about the situation, probably based on the reality on the ground, because Russia will not give up the idea of discussing the situation as it is, not to have kind of a fictitious situation where the Russia would leave all that. So now, Vladimir Putin said very clearly that he will not negotiate less than the occupation of the four oblasts, the four regions in the south. That's Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk. Those four regions are under or will be under Russian rule, and that's what he said. He said that just before that was the 14th of June, when addressing the foreign ministry officials, and he said that that's the minimal baseline, and that's we have now to take that as a baseline for the discussion. Then diplomats should do their work, but that's what the Russians want. They have put their condition on the table, and that's the way it is now.
And you know, to add to this, I think that I'm starting to, even as you're talking here, I'm getting the idea this could be a golden moment. This could be a start of something, because on top of everything you've just mentioned here, you also have the fact that this presidential debate in the United States last week, where the now leader in the polling, Trump, unequivocally said, I will have this thing over before I even come in. That part's ridiculous, but obviously his full intention is to bring this to a conclusion. So unless there's some magic formula to win in the next 4 or 5 months, the only path for Ukraine is to get the best deal they can now while there's time. So I think they could be onto something here.
Well, we could have some kind of situation like the one you had just before the election of Jimmy Carter in 19 that was
1980, wasn't it?
1980, when the team of the following president
Carter.
that was Reagan.
Yeah,
The Reagan team, in fact, negotiated with Iran the release of the hostages, so that they managed to have the hostages released the day after the election of Reagan, and that was engineered by the Reagan team, and it's just to show that, in fact, the President Carter team was not able to handle the situation. So we may have a situation like this engineered by the Trump team to solve the problem. And that's probably the reason why now Zelensky understands that, as you rightly said, this is a golden moment for the negotiation. And, you know, we have to go back to reality. On the battlefield, Russia is winning. They have the upper hand. That's no discussion about it, despite all these fancy figures we hear about the number of casualties, number of tanks destroyed and all that, which in my view, looking at what we have on the various channels that monitor the situation, this is not confirmed in any way by those who are really monitoring the battlefield on a day-to-day basis. So I think we are in the, as we said before, in a propaganda war regarding the number war. But so Russia has the upper hand, and we have to count on with that. There is no alternative way, and therefore I think Zelensky understands that as well. And there was also a few weeks ago one of the Ukrainian, I don't remember, probably it was Podolyak, but I may be wrong on that. That he said that if we want to end to the conflict in Ukraine, we have to count with some losses of territories. So there's some territories have to be abandoned. Nota bene, this is exactly what the report of the RAND Corporation, written in April 2019, was saying. It said, if we play this game and using Ukraine to weaken Russia, this will lead to the unfavorable peace for Ukraine, and Ukraine will lose a lot of personnel and lose territories. We are exactly in that situation.
Wow.
So those analysts of the RAND Corporation understood very well the impact and, let's say, the drawbacks of having a strategy that tries to weaken Russia by using Ukraine.
Not a good idea then. Well, I guess we're all going to find out what happens next. I'll be really eager to see what kind of press conference these two have after his visit here, what either one of them say, both, and then we'll be watching this going forward to find out if Zelensky's going to take this golden moment, or if more Ukrainian people are going to die for no good. In the last amount of time here I have, I'd like to kind of, as a coda, completely change track here, because I don't want to lose the opportunity we have to talk to you here. And that is, you mentioned something earlier, and I wanted to come back to it, in the other war that's going on between Israel and Hamas, and the potential that Israel could be ready to go into Hezbollah in the southern Lebanon. What is your assessment of that situation? Because many conditions make it look like Israel's about ready to go in there. And if they do, what do you expect would happen?
Well, Israel is looking for success. I mean, they have acknowledged that their objective to destroy the military structure of Hamas is not achievable. And that was said by the spokesman of the IDF, by the way, just a couple of days ago. So, meaning that they know that the war is lost in Gaza as they are seeking for some kind of success in the north against Hezbollah. The problem is that Hezbollah is a much bigger adversary than the Hamas in the north. And probably it's probably noteworthy to remind people that just yesterday, I think it was yesterday, that the Arab League decided to remove the Hezbollah from the list of terrorist movement.
Oh, I did not see that.
Well, that's in my view, a very interesting development, because that shows that the Arab League, which is Sunni, essentially Sunni, because the Saudi Arabia is probably the main power in this organization, and they decide to remove the Hezbollah from the list of terrorist organizations. They were pressed by the U.S. to put the Hezbollah on this list a couple of years ago. Now they remove it. That shows that the Arab League is no longer wants to be aligned on the Western position, and including the U.S. position on one hand, and second, it means that they consider that the fight of the Hezbollah is somehow legitimate, and meaning that if Israel tries to enter Lebanon, you may have then probably the support of some other Arabic countries to help the Lebanon to defend itself. I mean, I don't know, I don't have evidence for that, but the fact that they decide in that particular moment that Hezbollah is no longer a terrorist organization, that indicates that they give a lot of legitimacy to the Hezbollah. They understand this legitimacy, and that opens the door to have a support to Hezbollah. So
let me ask you a question. I was interviewing an Israeli colonel who's in the Air Force Reserve, who had served part of the time during this current conflict. And he just recently published a paper in which he said that there are a couple of different clocks ticking in Israel. There's one for the Israeli government and the IDF, and then there's another one for the Hezbollah and Hamas and their side on the other side. And he said if they had reached a negotiated settlement or found some way to end this war in the first 4 or 5 months, all the advantages would have gone to Israel. But the fact that it's now rolling into the 9th month, now that the dynamic has switched, and that there's more reason for Hezbollah to try and drag it out because the time works against Israel. Do you think that that's accurate? And could it be possible then that Hezbollah now wants to spawn a war because that could be bad for the Israeli side? How do you see that?
Well, you see, the Hezbollah cannot be exactly compared to Hamas. Hamas and the Palestinians at large are fighting for the territory on which, I mean, the territory of Palestine. I mean, they, in their minds, there is only one Palestine, which is currently mostly occupied by the Israelis, and they want this right to return in our villages and things like that, settlement and all that. So meaning that you have two people sharing the same territory somehow. The Hezbollah has a different perspective, because the thing is that Hezbollah, the rationale for Hezbollah to exist is the presence of Israel on Lebanese territory. And despite the fact that we say that Israel has left Lebanon in 2005 and so, this is wrong. I mean, most of the territory has been given to the Lebanese, but Israel has kept a lot of very tiny territories where they have position observation posts, intelligence gathering systems and things like this. And the biggest territory is the so-called Sheba farms in the eastern part of Lebanon. And and Hezbollah has said, as long as Israel still keeps those territories, we will have a war. Remember the war in 2006. You remember that this war, I mean, the Israeli intervention, has been prompted by the fact that Hezbollah captured 2 Israeli soldiers. Now, we have to understand that, because it was said that those soldiers were on Israeli territory. But it's not exactly true. In fact, when the Israeli left the Lebanese territory, they redrew the border to make a more favorable border for them from a military point of view. So if you look very closely at the southern border of Lebanon, there are 3 or 5 different borders, in fact. There is the one that has been drawn in 1948, and 49, I mean, at the end of the conflict with the Arab countries. And you have then a border that has been drawn by the UN, and then you have this border that has been, and there is also a border that has been drawn by the French in the 20s, as the territory was shared between the Brits and the French. So you had a border. So you have the border of 1920, you have the border of 1949, you have the border drawn by the United Nations in the 80s, and you have the border, or the last border is the one that has been drawn by the Israelis. And in fact, this border is not, all these lines are not exactly on the synchronized, if you want. And you have very tiny portion of territories that are still in possession of the Israelis. And in 2006, you had 2 Israeli soldiers on a territory that is considered as Israeli by Israel, but is considered as Lebanese by the Lebanese. And therefore, for the Lebanese, the Hezbollah captured those 2 soldiers, saying that they were on Lebanese territory. And that's what triggered the invasion of Lebanon in 2006. So we see that the importance of those very, very tiny territories is quite important. So that's the struggle of Hezbollah. But Hezbollah, at the same time, especially after the October 7 attack of Hamas, Hezbollah has done exactly the same as the Houthis have done in Yemen. They support the Palestinians through actions on the borders. And since the 8th of October last year, Hezbollah has attacked about 1,600 military objectives in northern part of Israel. You have about 100,000 people who have been displaced in northern part of Israel towards the center of Israel. So for Israel, it is a problem. At the same time,
which is why it gets to the, so I've got, in the amount of time we got left, I got 2 questions, one quick and one a little bit longer. First question is, what do you think the probability is that Israel is going to launch into Lebanon? So we'll ask that one first.
Well, that's the hardest question, because the problem is that Netanyahu is caught in the dynamics now. He has lost in Gaza, and this is clear. He wants some kind of revenge or some kind of legitimacy, and he needs to have some kind of victory to strengthen its political position. So, and on the other hand, you have the US, who tried every effort to prevent this offensive, because they think, rightly, that this may start a new regional war, because, as I said, you may have a support to the Hezbollah and to Lebanon. So I don't know. I have absolutely, because the Israeli government—
What does your gut tell you? 20%? 20%?
Well, I mean, that's very 50-50, because the problem is that Netanyahu is very irrational at this stage.
Right. So then the next question is, whatever the percentage, doesn't matter at this point. If Israel does for whatever purpose to try to achieve a victory, etc. What do you expect to happen, i.e., a short, quick war, or something else that could also drag into 6-9 months?
No, that will be something worse than Gaza. And probably the Israeli will do a lot of distractions, as they did in 2006, by the way. And now they have done the same in Gaza, and they will repeat the same, because that's the way they wage war, by disproportionately application of disproportionate force. That's what they will do. But the problem is that Hezbollah is probably one of the strongest army in the Near East at this stage. And that will not be without losses for the Israeli army. And that's probably the reason why the military in the IDF thinks twice about intervening in southern Lebanon. Hamas is a very small force, has a very difficult logistic route, and the whole logistics of Hamas is very difficult. But Hezbollah has not these problems. They have the support of Iran, of Syria, maybe other Arab countries. They have a very strong army. They are experienced. They used to fight the ISIS in Syria in support of the Syrian army. They have battle-hardened units, very well structured, very well commanded. They have very modern equipment. Again, they recently they have made this video showing a 9-minute video showing Hezbollah drones navigating on the northern part of Israel without being intercepted by any missile or air force and all that. And that is a major source of concern for the Israelis, because they saw that these drones was maneuvering and has counted all possible targets in the northern part up to Haifa, showing that in fact the Hezbollah has very strong capacities. Hezbollah has destroyed Iron Dome facilities, including launchers, showing that the Iron Dome is inefficient against this kind of attacks. So the Hezbollah has developed capabilities to make a lot of harm to the IDF, much more than Hamas, meaning that if IDF or Israeli wants to attack Hezbollah, they have really to think twice, because they will certainly do a lot of damage up to Beirut in the southern Lebanon. No question about this. But they will suffer a lot of damage as well.
Right. And that's why we just have to hope that some kind of sanity will prevail, that these concerns will be borne out, both from the United States and from certain aspects of Israel, so that they recognize that the cost would be too great and that they don't go. And of course, I hope that this is opening in Hungary, with Hungary and Orban into Zelensky and Ukraine will also produce some fruit to end that war too. That is our hope, and we'll see how it all develops, and we'll definitely have you back on as soon as we can as these things progress. So thank you for coming back on today. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
And thank you guys for joining us today. And I'll ask you to come back at 3:00 today. We have MIT Professor Ted Postal back on. He's going to talk about some new information about the strike on the Sevastopol beach a week or so ago, when allegedly a U.S. drone, a missile was fired on there and killed a number of civilians. And then also some other updates on some of the weapons being used. Not going to want to miss that. 3:00 today. Daniel Davis deep dive, and we'll see you then.